Oh, welcome, everyone. I'm Mariko Silver. I have the honor of being the president of Bennington College. Please come in. There are more seats over here and seats down in the well here. I know it's a busy weekend. There's a lot going on, a lot of wonderful sessions and conversations, but this one is always one of my favorites. And it's one of my favorites for a lot of reasons, partly because it's often an opportunity for me to meet, sometimes for the first time, some extraordinary alums of the college. It's also one of my favorites because I always learn something. Now, hopefully I learn something in all kinds of Bennington interactions, but this is one of the many opportunities that we create for students and for our community more broadly to hear what Bennington folks are doing out in the world. And it's particularly, in this case, kind of sweet spot for Bennington. It's my very great pleasure to announce, I don't get to announce a lot of things actually, maybe we should work on that, but to announce the recipient of this year's Elizabeth Coleman Visionary Leadership Award. The award was established by the parents of a member of the Bennington's class of 2000 in honor of Liz Coleman's 25-year presidency. We are honored to have Liz with us here today. I usually think everyone knows Liz, but perhaps actually not, so maybe you could just make yourself known, Liz, in whatever way feels appropriate to you. Yeah, well, too bad. And the award was created to recognize an individual from the college's extraordinary network whose inspirational leadership has advanced civic or cultural life, and in doing so has improved the lives of others. This kind of leadership is something we think about a lot at Bennington, and we're grateful to be able to honor the achievements of our alumni, faculty, and extended Bennington family in this way. The award is in its 4th year, and one of the architects of the award has said that leadership comes not from some innate quality of character, but from a continual practice of doing and creating in the world. This is something that members of the Bennington community aspire to work toward and demonstrate in big and small ways in their lives. And there are few who fulfill this ideal more completely than this year's recipient, Ben Hall, class of 2004. Ben is going to tell you about his work in conversation with Susan Scorbati and in conversation with all of you, but I'll just do a little of the pre-work for you. Ben is a chef and an activist who's created a new model of organizing through entrepreneurship that's receiving national attention. He's an artist and a musician who draws on that experience in the way he runs his business and the way he advocates for change. Together with Jason Murphy, another Bennington alum, class of 2009, who is here. Who is trying not to make himself known, seems like. But anyway, he's over there. Too bad, too late. He owns the Russell Street Deli, a heritage restaurant and soup manufacturer in Detroit. Ben and Jason rose up through the ranks there, eventually buying the business from the former owner. And I'm going to leave it to Ben and Jason to talk a little bit about that, but we also have another special guest with us here today. Ben's wife, Ariel Laws. They got married yesterday. That's really what we called you all here today to tell you, so you can all go now. Right. Being Bennington alumni, Jason and Ben were determined to do it differently. And I love what Ben and I were just talking about in the other room as we were getting ready to come in here. And I don't want to misquote you, so you can just dive in and correct me. But essentially that if you're going to undertake work in an industry, the restaurant industry, where there is a high chance of failure anyway, you may as well do it your own damn way. Right? You should do it differently. Don't fail on somebody else's model. Right? And even better, don't succeed on somebody else's model. Create it for yourself the way you think it ought to be. And Ben and Jason have done that. They've done that in a variety of big and small ways, and this is something that we talk about at Bennington a lot. Sometimes when you think about changing the world, making the world a better place, making the world as you want it to be, feels like a really big chunk to bite off. Right? Feels like it's too big to even start to do. One of the things that I admire most about what I understand Ben and Jason have done is they've done it in big and small ways. And the small ways are critically important and frankly not so small for those who live them. So under their leadership, the Russell Street Deli pays wages well above normal for restaurant workers and provides benefits like health care and a retirement plan. And they stuck with this through the long recession. Their workforce is diverse and empowered, and this is particularly notable because of where they are and who they work with, and I'll let Ben and Jason talk a little bit more about this. But Ben's nominator for this award said, "He has made a radical business thrive in a place many people had completely given up on." And of course, in addition to feeding their regular clientele and giving their employees a fair shake and encouraging their employees to think big together with them, Ben and Jason are deeply invested in addressing food insecurity, providing food, and working to change policies. The two have raised more than $125,000 for Gleaners Community Food Bank, the equivalent of 375,000 meals. They are the only local independent meal producer for Detroit public schools, providing free soups to 55,000 students. Recently, Ben was in DC advocating for SNAP, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, as part of his work addressing children's food insecurity. Ben and Jason have also testified before Congress on challenges surrounding entry-level jobs in the food service industry and the limits of growth for workers subject to minimum wage. And when he's not busy doing all of that, lobbying Congress, running a successful business, feeding Detroit school children, Ben is an artist and a composer. He has a forthcoming solo show at the end of this month at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit entitled "Slow an Alarm Until It's a Tone." He has performed at Lincoln Center and MoMA. He was a 2014 Kresge Fellow in Composition. I'll let Ben tell you about his time at Bennington, but I've heard a little bit about it, and I know that it was essential to the formation of multiple parts of his identity and his work in the world. To this day, I hear he's known to draw on the lessons he learned while working with faculty members Milford Graves, Bill Dixon, Danny Michelson, Ann Peibel, and of course, Susan Scorbati. I love seeing the exponential effects that a Bennington education has in the world. The way the network and the communities of students, faculty, and alums make the world a different place through the work they do together and separately. So Ben, congratulations. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for being here. Congratulations on getting married. And we look forward very much to your conversation with Susan. Welcome back.
Welcome. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So welcome everyone. I'm especially pleased and honored today to interview Ben Hall because he was one of my students not too many years ago, but some years ago. So Ben, I think what we're going to do today is I'm going to ask Ben a few questions to start our conversation and then open it up to all of you for questions. So we're pleased to get you engaged as well and asking Ben wherever you may be interested in the really important work that he's been doing. So I think we're going to start, Ben, by just asking you to tell us a little bit about your story from when you left Bennington to where you are now, because I think it's very interesting and we kind of want to know how this all happened for you.
Okay. Well, when I left Bennington, I didn't really have a plan. I didn't really have a plan when I came here. As my good friend Lon Twazan says, you know, like when poor kids go to Ivy schools, it's different. And so she went to Yale and I ended up going to Columbia. But it was a little bit like that. I had super culture shock when I went to Bennington. It was really difficult for me to be here, like it is difficult for a lot of students to be here for different reasons. Partially because I think that there's not really a place like this. I've been to a lot of places like Bennington that aren't Bennington, that, you know, that have a bucolic place and some beautiful buildings, and it feels vaguely like Hogwarts. And, you know, someone makes a Hogwarts joke at some point, even before Harry Potter. People were like, this feels like Hogwarts. You're like, what? So I think that that's like a huge part of it. So when my business partner, Jason, came to visit me in my second term, he was just like, I can't even believe this place exists. Because for us, I guess there's like a kind of growth potential to what can be in any space. Coming from a place where I went to 6 different high schools and didn't graduate. So when I applied to Bennington, and I had told, maybe some people in this room have heard this story before, but I didn't, it was kind of at the birth of the internet, so it was like 99, we had a modem, it was slow. So I called admissions and I say, hey, could you send me an application and a brochure and whatever the paperwork is? And they said, well, you just get that from your high school counselor. Well, having gone to 6 different high schools, I mean, my high school counselors were like guys who like made sure you got prenatal care, made sure you got community service instead of like going to juvenile hall or worse. So for me, I was just like, I don't even know what you're talking about. All I know is that when I read about this place, it said you didn't need a high school diploma. I didn't know that was for the Waldorf kids. I didn't know that was for homes. I thought it was like, I was like, it's Hood Rat University. They'll take anyone. And it's green. So when I came here, or when I called and I got the application, and after like 3 weeks of just going through it, I don't know if you guys remember this feeling, maybe from more recently, but especially from childhood, when you read something that you can't contextualize most of the information, or decontextualize it. You know, there's 7 or 8 words in the sentence that you don't understand, and you don't understand what they're referencing, and maybe they're even words you're familiar with. But it was a little bit like that. Like all of a sudden I had gone from feeling pretty good and feeling pretty smart and pretty autodidactic to a moment where I couldn't move any further. So I asked the guy I was in a band with, I said, you went to college, right? And he said, yeah, I mean, I didn't finish, but I went. And I said, well, there's this place that I'm trying to go, and can I show you this next week? So we show up for the gig next week, and I show it to him, and he says, man, this is a graduate application. I said, well, I told the guy on the phone I want to graduate. Now, mind you, I'm 25 at this point, but I didn't know the difference between undergraduate education, junior college, graduate education. Those things all seem the same to me because, and this is something that we deal with a lot with our employees and other people that maybe are still in our zone, is that if you don't know anyone who's ever been to college, there's no possibility of having that kind of conversation. It's just literally like your scope is so limited. And so as much as maybe we in this room are really happy, and I'm assuming that most of the people in this room have some college education or graduate education, there's probably some PhDs in here, you might forget that there's a time that there are people that even you might come into contact with every day that don't know anyone or feel comfortable to asking, because then once I decided I wanted to go, I found they gave me the FAFSA. And I was like, what is this arcane piece of documentation that I have to figure out? As someone who, if you've never been in an institutional setting, and you have to suddenly deal with this kind of really intense ladder of institutional language that doesn't exist in any other part of your life, it's super, super difficult to make that kind of cognitive leap from like rung 1 or rung 0 to rung 7, which you might think like, no, that's an easy jump. So for us, once we got back from Bennington, it was just like, it kind of, everything that we did while we were here kind of broke all the rules. It was like, oh, apparently there's no rules to anything. And this is something that a friend of mine kind of pointed out. Her dad was kind of a street guy, and my dad was kind of a street guy, and she said, there's one thing I learned about the art world, is there's no rules. And I was like, and I feel like that's a thing that I need to remind myself of as often as possible, because actually there's not. I mean, there are some rules. Even at the restaurant, someone will say like, I want to sit there. And I'll say, you can't sit there for these 94 reasons. And they'll say, you and your rules. And I'll say, well, first there's a tax man. And then there's like physics. Like there's a lot of things that have nothing to do with us. I'm just saying, like, if you're a single person and you want a table of 6, I can't, like, that's how we make money and pay rent. So when we came back, Jason graduated, what year did you graduate? In 09?
4 years after you.
Okay. 8 or 9?
9, yeah.
Okay, 5 years. I graduated in 04. This is our relationship all the time. So when he came, and another friend of ours, Jason Erla, who now lives in Baltimore, he also came to visit me, and he was also just a high school grad and was just like, where's this paradise place from? So he also came here. So they were here at the same time, and I was here. And the buy-in at that level that like, oh, apparently we made a good decision was good, because then once we got back to town, you know, most of my classmates moved to New York. You know, very few moved back to town. It's kind of like New York or move home, and no one wanted to move home. Well, I mean, I didn't have folks or a family to move back to, so Jason had like kindly taken care of our apartment that we had for many years, which was very cheap. Like when I moved in there, it was $150 a month. And this is only like 15 years ago. I mean, Detroit's still very inexpensive. My house was 23 grand. So we said, look, we just spent some money, we just did some work, but we can live there very cheaply. And so can we just try every single thing that we want to do? And like really kind of track it. I mean, that was the key. So there were two other Bennington people, one of which was Elliot Stevens, who apparently I found out, because I was like, Elliot, you're not going to believe this award I won. He's like, yeah, I nominated you, dummy. So Elliot also lived in Detroit, and we just all kind of did our thing, and he was working on writing, I was working on music, Jason was working on art, and we were able to basically find that like, not only were there no rules, there wasn't even like a kind of matrix that we had to fit into in Detroit. So it's very freeing. It was, you know, like, I mean, Jason and I still run our own gallery that's literally in a very, very fancy abandoned building. But it's one of those things where people come and they're like, this is amazing, it's like Dia Beacon. We're like, those are skylights. There's actually no lights in here, or power, or water. But like over a course of 3 years, we did like 20 shows, and those 20 shows got some national recognition. And it's kind of like if you don't tell people to look for certain things, then they're not going to look for them. There's like a certain kind of like relinquishment of preciousness that allows you to move way faster than you would if you were like kind of holding on too tight. It's a little bit of mice and men. Like if you hold it on too tight, you kill it. If you hold on too loose, it gets away. But if you kind of I don't know, what we try to do is just say like the stakes are like, we don't have to play by the stakes that exist. So I know that's not probably as clear as you wanted it to be, direct path. No. But I think like the thinking and the framework for like what like being risk averse is versus maintaining preciousness. Like once we kind of like exhausted the preciousness, it like really got easy to like produce things really fast and try and fail quickly, which is kind of what they tell you. I don't know if anybody's familiar with like lean startup. And so like the lean startup thing is like, can you go to beta tomorrow? Like you don't work on like getting to beta in 6 months, you go to beta tomorrow. And if you can go to beta tomorrow, you can find out if your idea works. So like if you want to start like a fitness app, and people would say, well, we have to develop the app and we have to figure out the platform and this and this and this. And it's like, we could actually go with a poster board to a gym and do it analog tomorrow. And then by like Thursday, you'll have this whole data set from which to work and to really be able to say, you know what, maybe this was just a bad idea, which sometimes it is. They're not all good ideas, that's for sure.
You know, just to ask a little bit more about this, because when I knew you right from graduating, I knew you as a really talented musician, percussionist, improviser, visual artist. So how did that get to the deli, and then the deli to the food systems, and the way you think about your employers, and you know what I mean, just that kind of transition?
Sure, I'll just
tell us a little bit about it. Okay.
Well, I guess the big part is that I mean, we kind of wanted to be musicians and artists, but also like, it's kind of low stakes. Like even if you're very good, like I have a friend who used to write charts for Motown, but you know, he still has to like get gigs at Nordstrom, playing on Friday night at Nordstrom. Why do they even have a piano player at Nordstrom? I still don't, but he's like, it's a good gig for me. The piano's already there. I go play for an hour, get $200. It's like a great Friday night gig. I don't have to go to a club. I don't have to worry about getting paid. The check always clears, right? So like if you start to like kind of move up the like scale, you start to see that like at each different level I don't know, whatever you're playing at. I mean, even in academia, I mean, for academics that are in the room, obviously, like when you're like reapplying for jobs, you can be like the second smartest person at a thing in the country and still like not get a job for 5 years. So, but that only assumes that you really need a job or that job to like produce that kind of space. So we had always worked, we worked at the deli since, I started there in 96 and you started there in 95.
Right.
So when I got to school, I mean, I worked there summers, I would like work there, I mean, I would sometimes go there back there for a weekend if I had to. Like,
So someone else owned the deli at that point?
Yeah, a guy who really loved smoking weed. So, and I mean, this is kind of central to our thesis about the way that we think about our employees, because every space for him was like a default to keep going so that he didn't really have to make decisions. But like, I mean, it's kind of like Langston Hughes, like in A Dream Deferred. It's like the fact that like he didn't care, he wasn't even living his dream, but like the fact that he wasn't living his dream like didn't allow us to live our dream. Which then you say, well, what's your dream? To like somebody who doesn't have anything or doesn't even have a dream. But like Jason said, oh, I think I'm gonna like try to go to college. So you took an English class or something like to like finish high school. And you know, he gave him a hard time about it. Like, well, then who's gonna close on Tuesday night? Which again, it's like, so then it's like you have to make a decision, like, do I wanna like try to increase my chance in the world or like expand my worldview? Or do I wanna like make an extra $46 before taxes? Which that $46 might be the difference between like where you live, car insurance, having $46. I mean, that might be zero, right? And a thing that we have to, when we're in kind of sometimes environments like this, someone will say, well, like so-and-so did this and they had $30,000. And they say, well, it's not a lot. And I say, well, for someone who has $0,000, it's, well, if someone who has $0, it's not just $30,000, which, I mean, assuming like we're in a very beautiful room, $30,000 is not a lot of money in some ways. But some people, it's 30,000 times what they have. So like imagining it like that on a purely like figure-based thing. So we worked at the deli the whole time we were there, worked there after, and then in 2007, he had like maxed out every credit card and kind of like screwed the business up as much as he can. And he didn't sell it to us because he was like necessarily a good guy. He sold it to us because he thought we were the least likely to default on the loan. Out of all his current employees. Right? He's like, eventually, like, I could sue them, they'll somehow land on their feet, and I'll be able to get some money from them. Whereas everybody else, you know, people who had been working there for 15, 20 years, they had nothing, partially because of him. Right? So he like kind of hampered them and their growth so that they couldn't. Wow. And so he kind of had a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we bought it from him on land contract. He held the note. And we bought it in August 2007, which is basically the best time to buy a business ever. But after a year, so we bought it to sell it. And we thought like maybe we could sell it for $100,000 more. And we'd each get $50,000. And then after taxes, we'd have $34,200 too. Whoa! Could you imagine having $34,000 at one time? Like, and Jason was like, I'm gonna build a pool. It's gonna be filled with nickels. I'm gonna be just like Scrooge McDuck. So we very much wanted to like do that, but we couldn't sell the business because everybody else wanted to buy it on a land contract, and we couldn't hold the note if he was holding our note, right? So it's like you can't sell a car that you owe money to the bank without paying the bank off first. So we're like, how's this gonna work? But then at the end of year one, we were up like 35%, and we're like, kind of good at this. Like, this is all right.
And why do you think you were up 35%?
Partially because we were like cleaning it up to sell it. I mean, like we thought we knew what all the problems were. So we were just, you know, if it was a ship, we just wanted to get it off the dock and get it seaworthy so we could like push it off onto some other unsuspecting sucker. I mean, really, it was in such bad shape. It was like, there were so many problems. So we had 25, so when we borrowed it, it was only for $175,000, and then he gave us $25,000 operating capital. So that was the 25 cash that he gave us as the bank, but the 175 we have to pay him with interest over a course of 7 years. Well, it was 2007, so 7.8%. Awesome, great, Ben. Which seemed good because we couldn't get a loan. But that $25,000 we spent almost completely in the first 6 weeks on refrigeration, because he had like this crazy Bahamian refrigeration guy who was like, put a dimmer switch on this refrigeration. You cannot put a dimmer switch on a refrigeration. I'm just gonna, anybody doing a home improvement project? No. So like we spent all of our operating capital in the first 6 weeks, and then it was just like, well, how are we gonna possibly? So we get like a little, and then we realized that we knew there was some theft going on just from looking at from math. Like you took in $25,000, you spent this much money, but you're still down like $3,200. We assumed he was taking cash, which is really, that's a restaurant thing. You take a lot of, in cash businesses, people usually take cash as much as they can so they don't have to claim income tax. So we just assumed he wasn't being upfront with us about taking cash. And it turned out that, so we thought there was one thief who we knew, but it turned out there were like 5 thieves. Oh, and one of them was like a straight up like embezzler. Like, and she had this amazing system, and we had to put in a spy camera. And we caught her, but Detroit being Detroit, they didn't arrest her. She just got to keep that 12 grand. Like, thanks. Like, that was awesome. We still see her all the time. She literally works at a place like a couple blocks away. We just be on smoke break, like, I got 12 grand. So.
What I'm hearing also, though, is just the amazing ability for you and Jason to, and because I was involved teaching improvisation with you, that there were the ability to improvise, be quick on your feet, problem solve. I mean, in areas that you're expressing that you really didn't have a lot of expertise in before.
That's one way to say it.
So I'm just curious, like what, and this kind of gets into the question connected to Bennington, like what about your Bennington education felt like prepared you to really tackle this, you know, this amazing way that you solved all of this, and then it sounds like became profitable, became successful in your community. I want you to talk a little bit about now how you work with your employees, having learned what you learned being an employee, and then how it's even grown now into larger food systems.
Yeah. So I was just telling Mariko this, that we really think a lot about metacognition, right? Like thinking about how to think. So we try to talk to the employees a lot about that, because I mean, our basic thesis is if 2 dishwashers can do what we do, probably any 2 dishwashers can do it. But you have to have a kind of like thought process about how to do that. So like when we hire a dishwasher, we tell the dishwasher, look, we were dishwashers. How far do you want to go? That's like the first step. And like, okay, so we're not punitive. That's one thing, like right from the jump, which again, I mean, I don't know what the general thinking is in the room, but if you're a $7 to $14 an hour worker in America, you live in a highly, highly punitive system. You're punished for everything. You're 5 minutes late, you're punished. Well, you're taking the bus, and you really don't, so what are you supposed to do, take the bus an hour early? But well, like, well, what about your kid, or what about your other job, or any of those things? So any of these things where like, if you have a kind of job where you make, say, like above 60 grand, you can be 10 minutes late, and no one's gonna beat you up about it. But also, if you make 60 grand, you probably get a fair amount of free stuff in your life. People buy you dinner. People, like, you get deals on things. Well, if you're a $7 to $14 an hour worker, you don't get anything for free. So we kind of shaped that language right at the beginning, and it's not necessarily, I mean, and that's for the employees. So it's not like we're pro-Marxist or something. We're like, just like, this is what capitalism looks like. So you should know where you fit in this scheme. So you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to recreate the wheel, which I think for a lot of like kind of autodidactic, I mean, you could do this, 50 years ago you could do this because like everybody was kind of like in a class flux, but as class structures get more hierarchical and fixed, it's much harder to be like, say, a poor kid who goes wherever they want. It's not really is acceptable, and if you're participating in a conversation, there's kind of, you have to be yourself, which you're kind of knocked for, and if you assimilate, you're knocked for it. So it's a weird, there's always this kind of, if you're outside of your group, which automatically you're climbing. So we kind of just try to teach the staff that from the jump. But it also kind of makes us, again, it's kind of like the no rule thing. It kind of reminds us to do that for ourselves, right? That we have to like constantly reimagine where we're at, and that it's not actually fixed. So I mean, I've been to DC more and more lately doing fly-ins and lobbying. So I was on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week, I was in DC on SNAP legislation. But the fact is that you'll go to someone, they'll say, we don't create policy by anecdote, right? So, and that would be like, well, I know someone who's on food stamps who has a SUV. Well, you don't really know what that SUV is. You don't know how much they pay. You know, you're just using it in the most like shallow, visual way. But the crazy thing is that like, I'll be telling my story about like being on SNAP. I was with this woman, Maria Iniguez, who owns a restaurant in, you know, she's like a 42-year-old grandmother, and her mom's still alive, and she's talking about like living on SNAP, and her sister, who's 47, getting SNAP benefits and having MS, and she gets $17 a month. And like, again, this kind of, it's not just $17 a month, it's 17 times what she wouldn't have if she was on SNAP. So that $17 is super important. So the crazy thing is they get all moved, and I'm like, well, now you're creating policy by anecdote again. It's just the other kind of anecdote, like which anecdote do you actually choose to care about? But then it becomes like who has the more forceful narrative about that. So you also have to teach employees how to create a forceful narrative, and then teach the customers how to kind of like re-buy in to that.
How do you teach someone a forceful narrative? I'm interested. Just what's the conversation like?
A lot of it's just about honesty. I mean, I think that's like a key element, you know, and not so, I was on a panel last year at the Star Chefs Congress about community activism, and this guy Will, who runs Star Chefs, kept saying, yeah, Ben, but like, how do you get involved? And I just kept saying, like, you show up. Like, there's no other real secret. And I think, like, you know, there are a lot of dominant narratives in the world, and if you don't, those are the dominant narratives because no one displaced them with their own narratives. Right. Like, this is a key element. So there's like a lot of different stories in this room, but people forget that their story, and I don't mean as an individual, because I'm not necessarily like pro-individual or the sovereign American, like libertarianism or something. I'm pro the idea that like that individual story put together in a group of people, each group is different, like improvisation, right? If you have 6 different dancers and they work differently and their bodies work differently and they enter space and hold space differently and everything about them is different, that's emergence, right? Like that's how the ecosystem actually responds to itself. And so we just like really try to like, it's a little bit utopic, but like that's actually what I want to believe in. Like that would be the knock like in grad school. Like people would be like, you're talking about utopia. And I'm like, no, I'm just talking about a healthier ecosystem than the one we have at present, which is kind of like leaden and backbiting and is not, I mean, in a truly capitalist environment, the way we've talked to a lot of VC people in the last 2 years about our soup company, because we still can't get loans from the bank for a bunch of different reasons. But the VC people are always like, I always just bring it back to capitalism. I'm like, yeah, we're just trying to create the most efficient model. And they're like, efficiency. Like they freak out. Like, yeah. And they're like, and then we're going to have this like technological basis. And I'm like, no, the reason it works is because we're making this soup the same way you made it 3,000 years ago and the body knows how to accept it. That's why it tastes good. Like not because of technology, right? It's still like a hard, so it's like you have to say that like, so we have to figure out, you know, and one of the things about kind of startups is, does anyone know what an idea maze is?
Could you say that again?
An idea maze?
Maze.
So like one of the, and this is something Jason and I didn't really know there was a word for this. We've been doing this a long time, is that you take an idea and you present your idea, right? You say like, my Aunt Cindy's cookies are going to be the best cookies. But you take them through all the routes of success, and you take them through every route of failure. And if you know the routes of failure, and if you know that the routes of failure outnumber the routes to success 3-to-1, you say, well, that's probably not a workable system, which is kind of the classic thing in restaurants, because restaurants are really failure-driven. It's kind of like someone will say like, they're spending $5,000 a month on rent, and I heard that they had like 800 grand in operating capital, and I'm like, well, you just divide 5,000 by 800, and you know how many months I'll be in business.
Wow.
Right?
So you're bringing a lot of systems thinking also, it sounds like, into the way that you're understanding what you're looking at and what could work or what won't work.
Well, and making sure that like everybody addresses that. I mean, there are, you know, people always talk about baseball as being an excellent standard for with which to, I mean, that's why there's such stats freaks in baseball, because they have like stats in high school and they have stats in college and then they have pro stats, and they're really watching a lot of stuff. And so you have a lot of stats from with which to draw from to learn about how systems management works. But it's a little bit the same in money, right? Like you have this much labor, you have this much profit, and you have these many customers. It kind of does work. So like we very much, I mean, even right now, like we very much like want to close the restaurant because the restaurant isn't profitable. 150 new restaurants have opened up in Detroit after like an insane restaurant drought for 30 years. Like we have a friend, Lester Guvia, he's opening up a restaurant. They're giving his rent's $1,000 a month with a free liquor license because they haven't had a sit-down restaurant on that block in 25 years. So there's 150 new restaurants. So we have a very busy place, a lot of clientele, a lot of 5-day-a-week customers. But if you say that each restaurant takes away 1 customer per day, that's like, I don't actually understand how we're still in business. Because, you know, we depend on people to come in and spend, say, $12 a day, 3 days a week, 50 weeks a year, which isn't a lot, but, you know, like 1 customer spending $10 a week is $5,000 a year, which is like a $2.50 raise for someone who makes $12.50. That's like an insane raise for someone. Is that 20%? I think that's 20%. But I mean, it's the same as like if you give somebody $1 raise, let's say you gave somebody $1 raise. Say, do you know what $1 raise does if you make $10 an hour? I mean, we don't really pay anybody $10 an hour. That's low for us. But it is a thing where it's like all of a sudden you have 10% more than you had before. And then you kind of have to say, Derek, what are you going to do with that extra 10%? Is that going to change your life? Because also if you have like if it is a kind of low wage job or a $7 to $14 an hour situation, the kind of tendency is to undertrain and overwork, which produces turnover. And that's where the undertraining comes in, because you don't want to have training costs be higher because you have so much turnover.
Wow. How did you learn about scaling up now that you're feeding 55,000 children in Detroit?
Well,
Could you just say a little bit about that? And then I think we're going to open it up to our people who are here to ask some questions.
Well, Jason and I are both like really good at asking people who are smarter than us how to do things. Like we're not shy about that.
That's important.
So that's a big part. I mean, I just wrote an op-ed about this for the James Beard Foundation, and we had talked about it a great deal. I kind of came back, and I was also working. I was working on the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act in DC, and you know, it was a room like maybe 3 times this big, and the ag committee's there, and all the senators are there, and they're doing their photo ops, and they have what's supposed to be like the best and brightest school food that will be federally mandated. So you know, it's $1 a day for each kid. So which means that there has to be like a profit center for the district. A lot of people got their hands on that $1 a day to be able to produce a meal for a child that for free. So Detroit is 88% assistance, and the other 12% just eat for free. They're like, well, we're at 88%, we'll just feed them all for free. And my friend Betty Wiggins did that, but when I was there, I came back to Jason, I said, I had all that food and it was all garbage. It was like all complete, like, you know, and it was like turkey meatballs with whole wheat pasta, but it all still tastes like school food because they're still using the same processing mechanics to produce that food, even though they're using different ingredients. So it hits certain kind of like mandated check marks, but it was still kind of just garbage. And he was like, well, you should just talk to Betty Wiggins and figure it out. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll just figure out school lunch in America. No big deal. He's like, well, I don't know what you want from me. I'm not like, that's all I'm gonna have. So, I mean, when he told me that, I was just kind of like, well, that is our kind of problem solving thing. And then all of a sudden, it's like the scale shifts. Like, okay, it's cool that we get to help our like 30 employees. But the fact is that like a lot of our employees, like they might be the only person on their block who has a job. And they're definitely the only person on the block who has a career, but people say like, that's amazing, you give people money and then they have a better life. And it doesn't really work like that. It's very much ripples in a pond. What you find is that like now their kid comes to the restaurant and the kid, now his father has a job or his mother has a job. And now it's like, it's a little bit more like what we think about as the family unit when they say like, oh, well, unemployment's super low and like we can't fill these jobs, something must be going right for America. And it's like, yeah, maybe, but if like an entry-level job for $850 only trains you to do another entry-level job for $850, which only trains you to do another entry-level job for $850. Meanwhile, inflation's going up, so you're not making $850 anymore, right? Mm-hmm. You still got a kid, and you still got to have 2 jobs. It doesn't really like benefit. I mean, and again, like kind of going back to the VC people, or even when we call on Republican representatives and congressmen, I just bring it back. I'm like, you want to talk about the American family? We can talk about the American family. Like, I'm down. I'm so down to like make it stronger and better. But like, you have to like include everybody in that system. Otherwise, the system doesn't actually work. Because how would capital know how to route itself to only their constituents?
Interesting. So did you bring all your 30 employees with you to the school lunch?
No.
No. So you didn't, they're still at the restaurant.
Yeah, they're still at the restaurant and manufacturing soup.
And so in manufacturing soup. So when you're now in this system of making lunches, are you just recommending how they're
we produce
cooking and make, you know what I mean? You're giving
the recipe, and then we have a what's called a co-packer who makes it for us. And it's like, I mean, we learned, been a learning process. We're going to Houston in November to start to make soup for them because our district supervisor for the School of Nutrition in Detroit moved to Houston, so it goes from 55,000 to 215,000. And they're gonna manufacture the soup themselves. So we'll get like, and I mean, we don't make any money. We serve 55,000 people, we get like $3,200.
Wow.
Right? It's like a part of a penny. But it has to like, the scalability of the model is totally focused on the fact that other people need to say, especially chefs. Well, I'm gonna just digress right now, and I'm gonna talk a little smack about chefs. But like, especially in the kind of food network environment, the fact is that like, I'll go to DC, I would be wherever, and people will be like, farm to table, urban ag, and Detroit's the #1 urban ag center in America. And I'm like, well, you know, there's still a lot of $17 tomatoes floating around. They're like, well, what's a $17 tomato? And I'm like, a $17 tomato is like when a foundation gives a group $36,000 and they only produce 6 tomatoes, right? Like, it doesn't always work because they're still working it out. And I'm not saying that foundation, and this is where it gets like over, you know, I mean, with all due respect to Republicans in the room, like, I don't really care. I'm just like, this is actually what they talk about with governmental waste, right? Because sometimes it's government money, sometimes it's foundation money, and I say, look, for that to even work, someone has to be the intermediary from the earth to institution to mouth. And there's only one person who can like kind of be before the mouth, and that's the chef. So the chef actually has like the mechanical and like systems intelligence to be able to figure out that food, and no one else does. I mean, farmers know how to grow food, like policy people know how to create policy and be policy wonks and be legislators. But there's only one person who can actually figure that out. So like when Jason kind of like set me that challenge, and when I talked to Betty Wiggins, who was the former head of DPSCD, she's like, there's no way you can make me a soup that you sell at Whole Foods for $9 and you can make it for the babies. And I was like, au contraire, mon frère. But you know, it means that we
all want to taste your soups, Ben.
But it means that you end up serving 55,000 people and making $3,200, which for a lot of people is not like a capitalist or entrepreneurial, like that's not the kind of return of investment that they want. But like what we talk about a lot is like, well, what is the return that we're actually looking for? Is it actual like greenbacks? And it's like, I don't know, we have a pretty rich and interesting life. So we have like, I would say a high quality of life and a pretty low income. But
that's very inspiring. I think it's very inspiring. Actually, really inspiring in a real way.
Yeah.
Yeah. and unusual, and, pretty unusual. Okay, we're going to open it up to we have about 25 minutes for questions from any of you who might, well, I have plenty of more questions, so it's not a problem.
Hi. I have a personal experience which echoes some of this, and I don't know what the word is, if it's microeconomics or, I'm trying to think like grassroots economics. And it's, I'm seeing it in the context of big money pushing down, forcing these small margins, forcing lower educations, low training, high turnover, and it's almost as if the capitalistic system that that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer benefits from that downward pressure onto this very microeconomic level. And I think that one of the ways that you could create upward pressure again is by making this microeconomic space more healthy through education, through understanding, so that those margins can grow slightly, so that there can be more awareness in workers of what's actually going on and how people are being used. Do you see what you're doing as creating that upward pressure, or don't you care, or is it?
Well, no, I totally care. I was mostly raised in, a variety of different my parents weren't together. I was kind of like a maybe not unhappy accident, not a happy accident, just kind of like, I guess we got a kid now. What are we gonna do with this thing, right? But I lived in a trailer for most of my life, and the fact is that there's only, in all my research, there's only two things that provide people generational, to break generational poverty. And Jason, maybe you could speak on this, because he's more on the generational poverty. He's more well versed in that stuff. You can only provide education and property ownership. Those are the only two things that changes it. In every kind of study that I've read. So we're just always, we give somebody a raise and we're just like, this is how it's going to look. And because in Detroit, so if you pay somebody, if somebody's a $10 an hour worker, they make $20,800 a year if they work every minute of every shift. They don't miss a day, right? Is there anyone in this room who didn't take a day off in the last year? Like old school factory style? Just straight up was like, no, I worked all 365. Exactly, right? So we may have softened a little bit as workers, but we happen to be from a real labor town. So speaking, I always get good feedback from labor people, and from all the people that I've talked to, it's only those two things. And so we really push towards saying what are you going to do? Are you going to buy a house with that $20,800? Because you can actually take that 20 grand, and if you're really strict about how you spend, you can buy a $20,000 house, which isn't a lot, but then over 5 years, if you really push, you can clean it up, and then you can buy a $30,000 house. So it's different than the kind of using property as a financial instrument, which is what it was supposed to do, which we found in 2007 it really didn't do with ninja loans and stuff. So we try to be real clear about what that is, and that's a lot of what we are kind of pie in the sky work is, rather than being restaurateurs or chefs. Because all my restaurateur and chef friends are like, I'm opening up a new concept, it's tacos. And I'm like, great. Tacos are delicious, everybody loves tacos and margaritas, but does it really solve any problem other than creating more tacos?
Would you add business ownership to those two, property ownership, education? What about business ownership?
I don't know. The research doesn't bear that out, but I also think the entrepreneurial bent. I think we like it because we can be super creative. We're not. So 150 restaurants, you lose a minimum of $1,500 a day, which is way more than our profit margin. Luckily, we had already started a soup company, which buffered that sum. But we're actually kind of excited that the restaurant's failing. We're kind of, because it's not us. It's not I started to lose my taste buds, or he started to stop figuring out how to use an Excel spreadsheet. It's just that's the market has shifted a little bit.
And you're also saying failure is okay.
Yeah.
Which is not,
a
lot of people don't see it that way.
You can't tell that to a venture capitalist.
Right.
Yeah, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But what about my 37x return I was planning on? Yeah, it doesn't work.
Exactly. Okay, other questions? Yes.
So I'm curious about I mean, it looks like the restaurant you see is not necessarily long for this life.
It's just going to take a different shape. We don't know what shape that is.
So there's sort of two thoughts I have. One was then what happens to the employees where you create a wage that the rest of the world doesn't seem to support.
They'll make more money at the soup manufacturer.
So they
So you would see them transition.
Yeah, I mean, so the average, I mean, just these are the National Restaurant Association stats. The average restaurant that doesn't serve booze, we don't serve booze at that restaurant, is 1 to 3% profit margin. And it's about the same as grocers, and it's about the same as farmers. Farmers usually a little less. Farmers usually in the red. So if you take that, those are the first 3 levels of the food system, and also 60% of the greenhouse gas in America is somehow associated with food, right? Between refrigeration, shipping, and packaging. It's like, oh yeah, that food system sucks. So like we're constantly thinking about like how can we move away from that. So like as soon as our wholesale soup, which is like 24 ounces, we sell it at all these different grocery stores all over Michigan. Jason's first thing was like, well, it's the same amount of plastic to make like a 3-pound bag that we can serve in bulk to someone. So like from a ecological standpoint, shouldn't we automatically be moving toward bulk soup production? Which of course, like at each level, like if you're not in the restaurant, you're not wearing a chef's coat, like then you're not a chef. And if you make soup that goes to like some institutional framework, but it's 24 ounces, you're less of a chef. Well, if you're putting it in bags, you're like barely a chef at all. But like I find myself in rooms with like, I mean, I was with Tom Colicchio on Wednesday, but he's like, this is my volume guy. He can tell us about volume. And I'm like, thanks, Colicchio. Right? You know, and then he rolls his eyes and everybody's like, that's what I got on the Food Network. But like the fact is it's a different model because if it's 1 to 3% and restaurant with booze is 5 to 10%, that's not like, I mean, the old model of like a person, to go back to your point, owning like a small entrepreneurial enterprise, 1 to 7 people, let's say, that's good if you want to own your job, right? If you don't necessarily want to be beholden to somebody else as a boss, but you're still beholden to the market. Right. So when the market shifts and you see it serve the same Miller Lite as everybody else serves, and the same bread and the same, because it's mostly the same, because of concentrated big ag. Well, how much can you do to be unique, which then kills the creativity of the individual? I mean, in terms of the sense of someone saying like, that guy's really smart because he figured out this thing. So I think it's actually like a very much like dying, this is actually like a flame out, this Food Network thing. This is the end of that. Like you'll still see people doing that, like the Mick Jagger, like rock star chefs. But like real chefs who are gonna like really do work are like guys like Anthony Mint, who owns Mission Chinese and like a Michelin star place, who has, I'm totally blanking on the name of his awesome restaurant in San Francisco that has like, they have their own aquaponics and they have their own farm, and the compost goes to the farm and then the farm produces a thing and then that stuff produces from the aquaponics, and he actually created an ecosystem. And if you talk to Anthony about it, he'll say, well, like, I basically, you know, you'll say like, well, who are your models? And he'll say like, Neo from The Matrix. And you're like, but he says it very, Neo from The Matrix. And you're like, why Neo from The Matrix? And he said, well, like, if we solve climate change, aren't we actually superheroes? Didn't we actually save the world? And I'm like, like that's a real challenge. That's a legit challenge. 60% of greenhouse gas in the United States caused by food.
You know,
40% food waste. So 40% so some of that, which we actually produce greenhouse gas for, is just then thrown in the garbage. 40% when I say some.
The restaurateurs don't care about climate change, but you're saying it's no longer going to be lucrative.
No.
So much, and so really it'll be more like looking at production, maybe home.
Or just the way you serve. I mean, like, what would it be if you served your own soup, but you were in this room? You know, that's not, so like I don't have servers, so I'm not like beholden to the $2.35 an hour federally mandated tipped minimum wage, which like depending on what state you're in, it's $2.35 an hour.
Right.
Right? And that does, let me tell you, growth of the American family, not so much. Can't grow on $2.35 an hour. And all the states that have gone to like $10 an hour, $15 an hour, Washington, Oregon, they're killing it. Like wages are higher overall because also there's more money if you're 10 to 14 or $7 to $14 an hour worker. 90% of your money circulates locally. So it actually makes local economies better. But like this is stuff that like you have to be, like as a chef, we had to learn that stuff because when you walk in as a constituent, you want to tell your story and then you're like, well, I got my policy side down too, my man. Right? Like this is, I'm not joking. I'm not here just like, oh, I went to DC last week. Like I'm here to like tell you how it's going to be because you work for me as a legislator, not as a politician. So you have to speak to their legislative side rather than to their politician side.
You know, it's interesting. We had a public policy forum here a week ago on clean water, and the former commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation, if someone asked him to get to clean water, because a lot of food systems came up around clean water, and it was, what's your recommendation? And he said, everyone needs to shift to an ecological mindset. So when you were just saying about this, thinking of the system, the food system, as an ecosystem, I think that's a really interesting, I mean, it's coming from a totally different area of clean water, but it's all, because the dairy farms, they have to all deal with, right? Their product and what it is full of and then what it's polluting. Anyway, it's just interesting to hear you say the same kinds of things. Yeah.
I want to hear a little bit about slow moving along and said it's exciting.
I'm sorry?
I want to hear a little bit about slow moving along and said it's exciting.
Oh.
And if at all that relates to what we've been talking about.
Well, I guess it goes back to Susan's initial question about like art, art and music. So that solo is my first museum solo. I've been in some museum shows. It's more just kind of I don't really compartmentalize. Like that's something kind of earlier on, maybe even at Bennington or after Bennington, people would be like, and this is also kind of a thing, like if there's a kind of class structure that sometimes people will be like, you're compartmentalizing. I'm like, no, I'm not compartmentalizing. And I'm going to tell a bit of anecdotal evidence to this point. When I was at school, a guy was like friendly with, but like it seemed like I was like, I didn't know what we were in competition for, but clearly we were in some sort of competition. He was like, that's the thing I don't like about you. You come in and you take 9 classes. And I was like, he's like, and you're not like 100% there. And I was like, all right, I don't understand. Wait, what? Like, what did I do wrong? I don't understand what I did wrong. I said, how many classes do you take? Or how many credit hours? He's like, I took 4. I was like, and I said, you can max out at 100%, right? He's like, I'm so serious about recording and this and that. And I said, okay, you get 400%. I said, I go to like 9 classes, I get like 60%, I get 540%. I'm just saying, like, I think we only get 4 years here, and you get to take as many credit hours as you want. So I'm just going to go for it, which, I mean, it's like, even when I got here, so I really came here to study with Milford Graves. I mean, that was like my big thing. I get here, I'm like, what's up, where's Milford? And they're like, he's on sabbatical, he just wanted to Google it. So I was like, well, first of all, explain to me what is sabbatical. Because I've never heard that word before. And second of all, what is a Guggenheim? I don't like where this conversation is going. And so I go to Susan, or I had a friend who was a touring musician. I ran a performance space in Detroit, and he had been there early in the summer, and he said, well, you know, when you come to Vermont, it's going to be hard to find an apartment. You should just stay with me. I was like, all right, I just met you once, and we've had 97 beers, so that seems like a totally appropriate thing. Didn't talk to him until the day I was at Hannaford's after orientation. Called him from Hannaford's, like, where do you live again? He's like, oh, I didn't know if I was going to hear from you, or you changed your mind. So I say, Milford, he said, Milford's on sabbatical. I was like, yeah, you could have told me that when I met you. And he said, well, you should take class with Susan. And I said, so I go to Susan, I said, my friend Jeff Arnott says I should take advanced improvisation. She says, you can't take advanced improvisation, you just showed up, Jack. I said, well, I don't care. When is the class? I'm gonna show up anyway. And so I showed up and I was just in, right? And then like, I think even at the end of the first class, there was like another new person, and it kind of became like someone was kind of playing the beat and there was a groove, and I just started like picking up cymbals and like dropping them on the floor. because I was just like, and afterwards Susan said, you know, I'm not so much into the metric pulse. She said, but those loud crashes really broke things up. And I was like, I'm home. I can do this. So I mean, it's really like so much of it. I mean, I don't think that word disruptor is like a word that I'm so, like I don't necessarily think about that. But like, if you're kind of just like a hood rat kid, everything seems like an opportunity. Everything seems like great and wonderful. And it just so happened, like up until this point, like I didn't have a wife, I didn't have a family. I had a lot of time. Like I would get off of work, I would just go to the studio, and you kind of figure out, you know, does anyone know this Sister Karita Kent? She has this list of 10 things for students, and it's very often attributed to John Cage, which is like, Cage is awesome, but it's kind of insulting that they're like, oh no, we can't have like any like Catholic nun in our art world. So we'll just attribute it to Cage because it seems kind of cool. But she says this thing like, you know, people who work on things all the time catch on to things. And I like totally took that, I saw that here when I was here, attributed to John Cage. In the architecture studio, and I was like, you know, it was like taped, and I was like I couldn't believe what the rules said, and they say like, come go to things all the time, like everybody's a student and a teacher. I mean, but one thing it says, find a thing to trust and trust in it for a while. Like in her totally blasé, zenish, I'm a beautiful supreme being type person. And the thing that I didn't understand until like 3 years ago is I trusted that piece of paper for a long while. And I still trust it. So it's more just like the way that you think as a creative personality or a creative person and like what creativity is. Because like, especially in the restaurant, like people say, very passionate. It's a vehicle. And like, well, being a chef is so creative. Being a chef is like one of the least creative things. The creative thing is that like, especially if you make everything from scratch, is that there's this wide variation in things that come from the earth that are animals and plants, right? So spinach this week. So if it rains, if you had spinach last week and it was hot, spinach doesn't really like the heat. So you're gonna get a certain kind of spinach, and then it rained all week and you roll it up, spinach is gonna be much happier. So so you're serving the same spinach soup, but the spinach itself is different, right? And then, you know, the grass is different, so the butter is different. Everything's shifting all the time. So what you're trying to do is take this thing that has a really wide bandwidth and get it to a very narrow bandwidth where it seems the same in your memory to what you had last week. So it's while your body chemistry is changing too. Like it's totally, that's what like good chefs do, is like take that like wide bandwidth, get it really narrow so that it jives with memory and taste. It's a really personal, weird thing.
Fascinating. Maybe two more, and then we're going to have to stop.
I just noticed here it says that your soups are vegetarian or vegan, etc. Are all your soups from the schools that way?
Yeah.
So can you talk about why you chose to do that and how the kids respond to that?
Well, again, so I happened to work at a steakhouse and a vegan macrobiotic restaurant at the same time for almost a whole year. And I would leave the steakhouse where I was a sous chef and go to the macrobiotic restaurant where I just served like pretty mediocre brown rice and mushrooms and zucchini, you know, wakame and seaweed. And the thing that I really realized from like these two radically different environments, like one sold $54 pieces of aged beef that we had to really like take care of, and one sold like, you know, pretty peasant-y food that's like a made-up system. Like people are like, macrobiotics is deep. It's not like Ayurvedics. That was made up in the 70s by one dude. It's a little bit like the Mormonism of food movements. Right? Like one dude being like, yeah, no, I just invented this, and you just take it for granted. So we, with all due respect to Mormons, I mean, for real, like I'm not, but I mean like Joseph Smith's just a guy who's like, I'm gonna invent a religion, and he did. I mean, that's a big move. Gotta give it up to Joseph Smith. Got a book, start a religion.
But one of the things that I went back, like that guy was in, what did he do? He did like executive training. So like how to think outside the box, and he was big on metrics. That's what he did nationally, and he worked with Microsoft and all these people. But he had studied animal husbandry in undergrad, which we have like an incredible animal husbandry and farming system at Michigan State University. Like we have one of the big ag schools in the country, especially in the north, especially in the east. So he was really deep on his meat game. And my thing was I came in one day and I said, like, I think our vegetarian game is weak. And they were like, don't, see the part where it says steakhouse up here? But like, we live in Detroit, so we have a huge Muslim population. We have quite a big Jewish population. And people are like often going through their thing. So at the vegetarian restaurant, most of the people that work there for political reasons. They didn't work there for food reasons. It wasn't food first. So they didn't have the same kind of relationship to making food and food chemistry that professional chefs did, because they usually weren't professional chefs first. They were like people who became involved in food later. So I just said, well, like, why don't we track it? And why don't, instead of like serving a $54 steak, and then someone's like, I'll have the vegetarian entree, and you give them like, basically like sauteed zucchini with oregano and noodles. Like, this is the 90s. It was very bad food. I said, like, well, why don't we really work on the soup and add a couple things, because we can, I said, like, I designed a little program, and I said, this is all stuff that we already have. And I said, well, just track it, because the way that I looked at it was like on Friday night, if we got a table of 4, and again, this is like going back to an early kind of like, you solve it like kind of like ethical or aesthetic or creative problem based on a like kind of like foundationally capitalistic or economic basis, because the numbers do the work for your argument, where like you can't just be all woo-woo about it and be like, I believe in vegetarianism, you know, just, so we tracked it, and the fact is that like a lot of times 9 times out of 10 there was only one vegetarian at the table, and they were ordering it for usually dietary or religious reasons. So they only have one option on the menu. You give them one option, and if that option wasn't good, first of all, who only wants one option? You don't go to a restaurant that only serves one entree, right? So that's immediately kind of, you're making that person feel less than. And there's a certain anxiety associated with that. I guess I'll have a vegetarian entree. So I said, well, what if we had 2 or 3, especially on the weekend, and we had like a couple killer soups, and instead of like, we would sell something like in the appetizer that we didn't like really push as vegetarian, but if someone said like, well, what are your other vegetarian options? You could say, well, that's also vegetarian. Well, that's also dairy-free, because especially for Muslim and Jewish populations. So we tracked it, and it was like, we were getting tables that would only be there once a month, now eating there like 7 times a month, because that one person was actually driving the conversation, because all of the other places like ours replicated the same model, which is to have one vegetarian entree, which is like, I guess you have to have a vegetarian entree. But now, like, we were getting, if there was one vegetarian at the table, they're driving, that one person is driving a $200 tab. So then it was like, you guys should start thinking more like Ben. Because also the profit margin was much higher on those items as well. So.
Okay, last question.
I'm curious as to how the African American spiritual music plays into your creativeness, and how you came to that conclusion.
Well, so what he's referring.
I don't mean the sacrament, I mean the collection on.
Yeah. So I grew up in the church a little bit. My mom was a woman who really, she's white. My dad is mixed, but my mom was just like. She grew up in Detroit, like in the 70s, and you know, it's predominantly African-American city, and it never occurred to her to leave, right? And she just, you know, she was just down, right? So she's got like a little like golden boy, and they're like, where'd you get this kid? And you know, then my dad shows up, and he's not like, a friend from Rwanda says like, you know, the first Rwandan in English meet, and they always make a Halle Berry. And then the Halle Berry makes a baby with a Rwandan or English, you don't know what happens. And my dad was a little bit on the you don't know what happens schedule, but like he identified as a black man in Detroit at that time. So as a consequence, we were just around the church a lot. And then I used to own a record store just before we bought the restaurant. And so much stuff was coming in that I would look it up online. I mean, this is like 2008, so all the information wasn't on the internet yet. They hadn't downloaded everything, but if you found something that wasn't on the internet, you're like, well, what's this? And some of these things were made by people who, like, it'd be a congregation. Maybe the church was only this big, and they only had 7 members that were musicians. They weren't always good. But it was a very homemade thing and very singular, so I just started keeping the stuff. And then at a certain point, I had like a little bit of money, so I started digitizing it, because I said, well, as a collector, what is the worst thing that a collector does is kind of hoard and not share. And I said, well, I have a little bit of money. I have a little like resource set. Like I've had 2 FWT students work on it, you know, like, and I always have to tell them, they're like, I'm gonna work on this amazing project. I'm like, it is just data entry. It's like very long form data entry of like, you know, a sermon is 27 minutes. So it's like you press play on the record player and you record it, but I have like, I don't know what it is now, but it's like at one point I had like 130 of only known copies. Like the guy who runs the gospel discography for America, who also works with the Library of Congress, contacted me. He's like, I need all the information on all these records because no one else knows that these records exist. And it's a fundamental part of like, I mean, if you want to research rock and roll, like there's so many, as a folk way, it was super important. And when I was a kid, I had so many crazy experiences at church that were very much, if anybody remembers the Blues Brothers, when they catch religion, that were almost that deep. Like where it's like, you know, people are catching the Holy Ghost, people are really like in it. So it just ended up being a project. And it's that, I don't know, I just kept running. And it's now the largest of its kind. And, you know, I'm in conversation with the Library of Congress just to make sure that it has a home at the end. But, you know, now it's like 10,000 recordings.
Okay, I think we have to stop now, which is a shame because we could go on for quite a while longer. But I think if you're okay with a few people, if they want to come up and ask you some questions individually, feel free to come. Well, thank you, Ben. So.